There are stories that refuse to die, stories that linger for decades, whispered from one generation to the next because nobody has ever managed to explain them. Some are terrifying, some are tragic. And then, every so often, one comes along that's so utterly bizarre, so completely ridiculous, that you almost dismiss it before you've even heard the evidence. After all, a talking mongoose? Really? It sounds less like a paranormal mystery and more like the plot of an old children's cartoon. But that's exactly what makes this case so fascinating, because nearly a century later, intelligent people are still arguing over what happened inside a lonely farmhouse on the Isle of Man. Was it one of Britain's strangest hauntings? A remarkably elaborate hoax? A psychological phenomenon unlike anything seen before? Or was it simply the product of one family's extraordinary imagination? Whatever the truth may be, the story you're about to hear has everything. Ghost hunters, psychologists, newspaper frenzies, court cases, a family whose lives would never be the same. And, sitting right in the middle of it all, a foul-mouthed, rabbit-hunting, biscuit-loving mongoose who insisted he was an extra clever mongoose. This is the story of Gef. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Eclectic, the podcast where folklore, true crime, the paranormal, strange history, and the wonderfully unexplained all collide. I'm delighted you've decided to join me once again. This week's episode is, well, it's different. Over time, we've explored serial killers, disappearances, haunted houses, cryptids, and unexplained phenomena. But I don't think we've ever met quite a character like today's. Imagine trying to explain this to one of your friends. So, what did you listen to on your drive home? Oh, just a podcast about a talking mongoose that threatened to murder people, criticised their home decor, demanded bananas and biscuits, insulted ghost hunters, claimed to have lived in India, and insisted he was the eighth wonder of the world. It sounds ridiculous. In fact, if someone made the whole thing into a Hollywood comedy, you'd probably accuse the writers of making it all up. Except they did. In 2023, the extraordinary tale even inspired the film Nandor Fodor and the Talking Mongoose, introducing Gef to an entirely new generation. But today's episode isn't about the film. It's about the real case. Because underneath all the absurdity lies something genuinely unsettling. Hundreds of people claimed they heard the strange voice. Respected investigators travelled to one of Britain's most isolated islands to uncover the truth. Scientists examined physical evidence. Psychologists proposed startling theories. Journalists, they couldn't get enough of it. And the family at the heart of the mystery maintained, right up until the very end, that they had told the truth. Whether you believe them, well, I'll leave that decision entirely up to you. Before we travel back to the early 1930s, it's worth understanding the world in which this extraordinary story unfolded. Britain was still carrying invisible scars. The First World War had ended little more than a decade earlier, but millions of families were still grieving loved ones who had never come home. Many had no grave to visit, no final goodbye. At the same time, the Great Depression cast a shadow across Europe. Jobs were scarce, money was tight, and another war was beginning to feel like an uncomfortable possibility. In uncertain times, people often search for certainty in unusual places. Interest in seances, mediums, and afterlife exploded across Britain. Spiritualist churches attracted new members, ghost stories filled newspaper columns, and investigators such as Harry Price became household names. Today, we might binge documentaries about haunted locations. But back then, people queued to attend seances. They debated ghosts over dinner. Newspapers eagerly printed stories of hauntings and mysterious phenomena because readers simply couldn't get enough of them. Into that strange cultural landscape wandered one of the most bizarre stories Britain had ever seen. Not a ghost, not a demon, not even a poltergeist, but a talking mongoose. Our story takes us to the Isle of Man. Nestled in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland, the island has always possessed an identity all of its own. By the 1930s, holidaymakers flocked there every summer. Steamships arrived, packed with families eager to escape smoky industrial cities. Douglas bustled with promenades, dance halls, brass bands, and seaside entertainment. Electric trams rattled along the coastline. Hotels advertised modern comforts and sea views. But venture only a few miles inland, and it became another world entirely. Narrow country lanes twisted through fields divided by ancient stone walls. The wind rolled endlessly across open farmland. Sea mist drifted inland without warning. Scattered farmhouses stood alone against the landscape, surrounded by little more than a sheep, crows, and silence. One of those farms sat near the tiny hamlet of Dalby. Its name was Dorlish Cashen, sometimes called Cashen's Gap. It wasn't grand, it wasn't famous. In fact, most people had never heard of it. That would soon change, because inside those weathered stone walls lived a family whose lives were about to become part of one of the strangest mysteries of the 20th century. James Irving, his wife Margaret, and their teenage daughter Vori. By all accounts, they were ordinary people. Quiet, hard-working, not prone to seeking attention, which perhaps is one of the reasons their story proved so difficult to dismiss. They had nothing obvious to gain. No book deals, no television interviews, no social media followers. In fact, as we'll discover later, the story would ultimately cost them far more than it ever gave them. But in September 1931, none of that had happened yet. There was only an old farmhouse, a family settling down for another evening, and a sound, coming from inside the walls. If you've ever lived in an old house, you'll know they have a language all of their own. Floorboards complain under your feet, pipes knock without warning, timbers expand and contract as temperatures rise and fall. And when the wind begins to howl outside, an old farmhouse can sound almost alive. That's exactly what James Irving believed was happening. Nothing more, nothing less. When the first scratching noises began somewhere behind the wood panelling of Dorlish Cashen in September 1931, nobody panicked. Why would they? The countryside was full of wildlife. Mice squeezed through impossibly small gaps, rats found warmth wherever they could. Ferrets, stoats, and weasels weren't exactly uncommon visitors either. So when strange rustling echoed through the walls, James did what most farmers would have done. He reached for a trap. Nothing. He checked outside. Nothing. He searched the loft. Still nothing. Whatever was making the noise seemed to vanish the moment anyone tried to find it. For days, then weeks, the scratching continued. Sometimes it came from the bedroom walls, sometimes beneath the floor, sometimes directly above their heads. It never seemed to stay in one place for very long. Margaret later recalled hearing what sounded like something scrambling through the wall cavities, as though it were darting from one room to another, just beyond reach. The family searched repeatedly. They found no nest, no droppings, no obvious point of entry. Nothing that explained what they were hearing. At first it was merely irritating. Then it became unsettling, because the sounds began to change. The scratching was joined by soft whistles, clicks, odd chirping noises, occasionally something resembling a bark. Other times, almost the cry of a baby. Imagine lying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, listening as something moves around your home, never quite revealing itself. Every creak becomes significant, every silence somehow worse. The Irvings later claimed the noises almost seemed responsive, as though whatever lived inside the walls knew exactly when it had their attention. James remained practical. There has to be an explanation. There always is. Didn't there? Weeks passed. Then one evening, everything changed. According to the family, the strange whistles gave way to something entirely unexpected. Words. At first they weren't entirely clear. A muttering voice, fragments of sentences, the sort of thing your brain desperately tries to interpret into familiar sounds. Have you ever thought somebody called your name, only to realise it was the television in another room? Or heard voices in the wind before recognising it was just branches rubbing together? The human brain is remarkably good at finding patterns where none exist. Perhaps that's all this was. That's certainly what most people would later argue. But the Irving family insisted this was different. The voice became clearer, more confident. It answered questions, interrupted conversations, repeated things it had overheard. It laughed. Sometimes it sang. And then one day, it introduced itself. I am Gef. Pronounced Jeff, not Jeffrey. Simply Gef. It was, the voice explained, an extra clever mongoose. Which, if you're James Irving, is probably not the answer you were expecting. Naturally, James demanded proof. If something was speaking from inside his walls, he wanted to see it. Gef wasn't keen on that idea. Whenever James searched behind cupboards or lifted floorboards, the voice became indignant. You're looking. Stop looking. Turn your head, you bastard. I cannot stand your eyes. Not exactly the sort of language you'd expect from an ordinary mongoose. In fact, ordinary hardly described Gef at all. Over the coming months, the family claimed they learned an astonishing amount about their unseen houseguest. He insisted he wasn't a spirit. Well, not exactly. I am not a spirit. I am a little extra clever mongoose. Then, seemingly contradicting himself moments later, I am an earthbound spirit. Then, I am a ghost in the form of a weasel. Consistency, it seems, wasn't one of Gef's strengths. His backstory became stranger by the day. He claimed he had been born near Delhi, India, in 1852, that he'd travelled the world, been shot at, lived with a man wearing a green turban, shared a home with a hunchback, eventually finding his way to this isolated farmhouse on the Isle of Man. Quite how an 80-year-old Indian mongoose ended up chatting through the walls of a Manx farmhouse, Gef never satisfactorily explained. Then again, nobody ever accused him of being straightforward. Despite all his outrageous claims, the Irvings gradually stopped treating him like an intruder. Instead, he became part of the household, a very strange member of the household, but family nonetheless. Every morning they spoke to him, every evening he spoke back. Sometimes for hours. Gef developed favourites. He adored young Vori. He tolerated Margaret because she fed him. And James, well, James was apparently useful because he answered Gef's endless streams of questions. As Gef himself once put it, I have 3 attractions. I follow Vori, Mam gives me food, and Jim answers my questions. It was an oddly domestic arrangement, almost cosy, if you ignored the fact one member of the family allegedly lived inside the walls and claimed to be an immortal talking mongoose. Gef also had opinions, lots of them, about almost everything. He complained about the food, demanded treats. Well, Jim, what about some grubbo? He insisted on bananas, liked biscuits, developed a taste for chocolate, and wasn't shy about making requests. Put the bloody gramophone on! Sometimes he'd grumble about having a cold. Other times he'd claim his tail hurt. He sounded less like a supernatural entity and more like a permanently disgruntled elderly relative who'd overstayed their welcome. Which somehow made the whole thing even stranger. Because if this really was an elaborate hoax, it was an extraordinarily detailed one. By now, you might be wondering something. If Gef really existed, why did nobody ever simply see him? Well, according to the Irvings, they did. Sort of. Not often, and not for very long. They described fleeting glimpses rather than prolonged encounters. A flash of yellow disappearing around a doorway. 2 bright eyes peering from behind a beam. A small creature darting across the yard before vanishing into the hedgerows. Vori, who seemed to enjoy the closet relationship with Gef, claimed he was no larger than a small rat, covered in yellowish fur with a long, bushy tail, tipped by a distinctive black mark. Others described him rather differently. Some said he looked like a weasel, others insisted he resembled a ferret. A few thought he was closer to a mongoose. No 2 descriptions matched perfectly, which of course only added another layer to the mystery. If dozens of people were seeing the same creature, why couldn't they agree on what he looked like? What everyone did agree on was his voice. The Irvings claimed Gef could chatter for hours without taking a breath. He spoke in a high-pitched, slightly raspy tone that constantly shifted between humour, arrogance, and menace. One moment he sounded like a mischievous child, the next, an ageing actor performing Shakespeare. Then, without warning, he'd launch into a foul-mouthed insults that would make even seasoned sailors blush. He seemed to delight in shocking people. If a conversation became too serious, Gef would interrupt. If someone ignored him, he'd complain. Visitors questioned his existence. He'd become positively offended. In many ways, he behaved less like an animal and more like someone desperate to remain the centre of attention. Yet, for all his bluster, Gef also claimed to be useful. According to the family, he acted as a sort of supernatural watchman. If strangers approached the farmhouse, Gef supposedly announced their arrival long before they reached the front door. If unfamiliar dogs wandered onto the property, he'd warn the family. Should someone accidentally leave the stove burning overnight, Gef allegedly alerted them before disaster struck. And if anybody overslept, Gef made sure they didn't stay in bed for long. An unusually considerate mongoose. At least, sometimes. His relationship with the farm's wildlife was rather less compassionate. The Irvings claimed Gef hunted rabbits with astonishing efficiency, often leaving them outside as gifts for the family. He also took it upon himself to patrol the farmhouse for mice. Although, apparently, he found terrifying them far more entertaining than actually catching them. It's difficult not to smile at that image. A talking mongoose chasing mice simply for the fun of watching them panic. It sounds absurd, yet the family recounted these stories with complete sincerity. Food was another of Gef's great passions. The Irvings said they regularly left meals for him in a small saucer suspended from the ceiling. Not because he couldn't reach the floor, but because apparently that was how Gef preferred to dine. His tastes were surprisingly refined. Bananas, chocolate, biscuits, fresh meat, and whenever he felt he'd been overlooked, he wasn't shy about complaining. "Well, Jim, what about some grubbo?" Or, "Hey, you devil, I want Choco." Imagine hearing those demands drifting through the walls while you're trying to eat your own dinner. It's either deeply unsettling or oddly hilarious. Perhaps it's both. But beneath Gef's comic exterior lurked something darker. He wasn't merely eccentric. He could be frightening. One moment he'd be asking for biscuits, the next, he'd calmly remind the family just how dangerous he claimed to be. "I am not evil. I could be if I wanted. You don't know what damage or harm I could do if I were roused. I could kill you all. But I won't." Now, it's tempting to laugh at statements like that. After all, they're supposedly coming from an invisible mongoose. But place yourself in the Irving family's position. It's late at night. The house is silent. A voice you cannot locate suddenly tells you it is considered murdering everyone in the house. Even if you didn't believe it, wouldn't that linger in the back of your mind? Gef seemed fascinated by creating uncertainty. He constantly contradicted himself. Was he a spirit? Sometimes. Was he an animal? Also yes. Had he lived in India? Apparently. Was he immortal? Possibly. Did he know the secrets of the universe? Absolutely. Or at least, he claimed to. At one point, he proudly declared, "I'll split the atom. I am the fifth dimension. I am the eighth wonder of the world." Considering this was years before the atomic bomb entered public consciousness, it's an oddly striking claim. Then again, Gef made so many extraordinary statements that separating coincidence from prophecy is almost impossible. Perhaps my favourite Gef quote says more about his personality than anything else. "If you knew what I know, you'd know a hell of a lot." It's simultaneously arrogant, funny, and strangely philosophical, almost as though Gef wanted everyone to believe he possessed knowledge forever beyond human understanding. Whether he actually did, well, that's another matter entirely. As months passed, something remarkable began to happen. The Irving family stopped treating Gef as a mystery. Instead, he just became normal. They chatted with him while working, argued with him, laughed at his jokes, rolled their eyes at his complaints. It was almost as if they'd accepted the impossible, which raises an uncomfortable question. If this really was a hoax, how do you sustain that level of commitment every single day? Not for a weekend, not for a month, but for years. Either the Irvings were extraordinary performers, or they genuinely believed there was someone, or something, sharing their home. And before long, they wouldn't be the only people asking questions, because word of the talking mongoose was about to escape the quiet lanes of Dalby and spread across Britain like wildfire. At first, the Irving family kept the story largely to themselves. Well, who wouldn't? Imagine trying to explain to your neighbours that an invisible mongoose had moved into your walls, spoke in several languages, demanded bananas, and regularly criticised your housekeeping. You'd probably expect one of two reactions: laughter, or concern for your mental well-being. For a while, the Irvings simply got on with life. James continued working the farm, Margaret managed the household, Rory attended school, and somewhere behind the panelling, Gef continued talking. But secrets have a habit of escaping, especially in small rural communities. Before long, neighbours began hearing whispers. There were stories of strange voices drifting across the fields. People claimed something could occasionally be heard shouting from hedgerows. Others reported hearing laughter when no one else appeared to be nearby. Some dismissed the rumours immediately. Others became curious. A few wanted to hear the mysterious voice for themselves. It wasn't long before visitors began arriving at Dawlish Cashan. Some came out of genuine concern. Others hoped to expose an obvious fraud. Many simply wanted a good story to tell when they got home. The farmhouse, once little more than another lonely building among the rolling Manx fields, slowly became an unlikely tourist attraction. And Gef? Well, he seemed to enjoy every second of it. According to the Irvings, he often knew visitors were approaching long before they reached the front gates. Sometimes he'd announce them by name. Other times he'd mock them before they even knocked on the door. It was as though he'd become the world's most rudest maitre d'. Not everyone left disappointed, though. Several visitors claimed they genuinely heard a voice. Some described it as shrill. Others said it sounded oddly theatrical. A few insisted they caught fleeting glimpses of a yellow fur disappearing around corners. One visitor, Arthur Morrison, he later claimed he heard Gef speaking from beneath the very bed on which he was sleeping, and even reported seeing two glowing yellow eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Two local teenagers separately claimed to have seen the strange creature outdoors, describing a small yellow animal with distinctive dark mark on its tail. None of these accounts proved anything, but they did something almost as powerful. They added momentum. Every new witness, every rumour, every half-glimpsed movement made the legend grow. Soon the local newspapers caught wind of the story, then national papers, then international ones. The timing couldn't have been better, or worse, depending on your point of view. Britain in the early 1930s was captivated by the unusual. Readers devoured stories about hauntings, seances, and unexplained phenomena. Editors knew that nothing sold newspapers quite like a mystery, and here was one unlike anything they had ever seen before. Not another haunted manor house, not another ghostly monk, not another phantom carriage. A talking mongoose. Even writing those words today feels faintly ridiculous. Imagine reading them over your morning tea in 1932. They must have seemed utterly surreal. Journalists descended on the Isle of Man. Some arrived expecting an obvious practical joke. Others secretly hoped they were about to witness one of the greatest paranormal discoveries in British history. Most left, more confused than when they arrived. One early reporter, trying to reassure sceptical readers that the Irvings weren't simply seeking attention, wrote, "The people who claim it was the voice of the strange weasel seem sane, honest, and reasonable folk, are not likely to indulge in a difficult, long drawn-out and unprofitable practical joke to make themselves the talk of the world." That's an interesting choice of words. Not eccentric, not delusional, not attention-seeking. Instead, sane, honest, responsible. Whether the reporter believed in Gef is almost beside the point. What mattered was that the family themselves didn't fit the stereotype people expected. They weren't flamboyant showmen. They weren't charging admission. They weren't selling tickets. If this really was an elaborate deception, It seemed to offer remarkably little reward. That isn't to say everyone was convinced. Far from it. Many locals believed Wari was playing tricks. Some suspected ventriloquism. Others argued that the family had simply become caught up in a story that gradually spiraled beyond their control. One newspaper reporter later claimed he caught Wari making unusual noises herself, only for James Irving to insist they had come from somewhere else entirely. Was that evidence of deception? Perhaps. Or perhaps the reporter misunderstood what he'd witnessed. Like so much in this case, nothing was ever straightforward. Meanwhile, Gef himself appeared to relish the growing attention. He developed opinions about almost everyone who came to investigate. He mocked their appearance, questioned their intelligence, complained about their manners. At one point, discussing one particular visitor, he scoffed, +4s, Oxford bags. Apparently, even paranormal mongooses could be fashion critics. On another occasion, he remarked, I like Captain MacDonald, but not Harry Price. He's the man who puts the kibosh on the spirits. Which is rather remarkable, because at that point, Harry Price hadn't even arrived. That single remark would later become one of the story's strangest little details. Did Gef somehow know Britain's most famous ghost hunter was coming? Had the family already heard rumours of the investigation? Or was someone simply improvising another chapter in an ever-growing performance? Whatever the answer, the stage was now set. The newspapers had done their work, curiosity had become obsession, and before long, Britain's most famous paranormal investigator would make the journey across the Irish Sea to discover whether the talking mongoose was genuine, or one of the most ingenious hoaxes ever conceived. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Harry Price wasn't interested in stories. He wanted evidence, and evidence has a habit of ruining even the best legends. By 1935, the story of Gef had travelled far beyond the Isle of Man. What had begun as whispered conversations between neighbours had become headline news across Britain. The so-called Dalby spook had become something of a celebrity. Some people laughed, others believed every word, and plenty sat somewhere in the middle, unsure what to think. There was, however, one man who wasn't interested in rumours. He wanted facts, and his name was Harry Price. If you've listened to the previous episodes of the Eclectic, there's a good chance you'll recognise him. Price had spent years investigating seances, haunted houses, mediums and poltergeists. Depending on who you asked, he was either Britain's greatest ghost hunter or Britain's greatest showman. Perhaps he was a little of both. Born in London in 1881, Price developed an early fascination with magic and illusion. Unlike many paranormal investigators of his day, he understood how easily the human senses could be deceived. He studied conjuring tricks, exposed fraudulent mediums, and collected one of the largest private libraries on magic and psychical research in Britain. That background gave him an unusual advantage. When he investigated a haunting, he wasn't simply looking for ghosts. He was looking for trapdoors, hidden wires, secret compartments, acoustic tricks, anything that might explain the impossible without invoking the supernatural. Yet Price wasn't a hardened cynic. Far from it. If a case genuinely impressed him, he was perfectly willing to say so. He approached each investigation with a simple philosophy. Show me the evidence. If the evidence survived scrutiny, excellent. If it didn't, well, that was the answer. When news of the talking mongoose reached him, Price couldn't ignore it. A talking animal wasn't simply unusual, it was almost unique. Ghosts supposedly whispered. Poltergeists threw objects. Mediums claimed to channel the dead. But an 80-year-old mongoose from India who demanded biscuits and criticised visitors' clothing? Even by Harry Price's standards, this was something new. In July 1935, he boarded a boat for the Isle of Man. Travelling with him was Richard Lambert. Lambert wasn't a ghost hunter. He was a respected journalist and editor of The Listener, the BBC's influential weekly magazine. Bringing Lambert served an important purpose. If anything extraordinary happened, there would be another highly credible witness. No accusations of exaggeration, no claims that Price had imagined it, 2 experienced observers, 1 extraordinary mystery. As their ferry approached the island, the contrast couldn't have been more striking. Holidaymakers filled the decks, families laughed. Children raced along the railings. Steam drifted into the summer sky. To most passengers, the Isle of Man meant holidays, fresh sea air, promenades, dance halls. For Price, it meant work. Somewhere beyond the coastline lay an isolated farmhouse where an invisible mongoose, allegedly, held conversations with its owners. It sounds absurd, and I'm sure Harry Price thought exactly the same thing. But he also knew something else. Sometimes, the strangest cases reveal the simplest truths. The journey to Dawlish Cashen took them away from the bustle of Douglas and into the quieter western reaches of the island. The roads narrowed, stone walls lined the lanes, fields stretched away towards rugged cliffs battered by the Irish Sea. Eventually, the farmhouse came into view. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. No crumbling Gothic mansion, no sinister silhouette against the skyline. Just a modest stone house weathered by decades of Manx wind and rain. It looked ordinary, which somehow made the stories surrounding it even stranger. James Irving welcomed the visitors warmly. He had grown accustomed to curious strangers by now. Journalists, neighbours, sightseers, believers, skeptics, all hoping to witness something extraordinary. Price explained exactly why he'd come. He wanted to observe, to ask questions, to examine whatever evidence existed. James agreed, if Gef was willing. That last condition would prove rather important, because as the investigators quickly discovered, Gef wasn't particularly interested in cooperating. Days passed. Harry Price waited. He listened, he interviewed the family, he explored the farmhouse, he examined the walls, he noted every detail, and throughout it all, silence. No mysterious voice, no insults drifting from the ceiling, no boasts about being the eighth wonder of the world, no demands for bananas, nothing. Imagine being Britain's most famous ghost hunter, travelling hundreds of miles to investigate one of the century's strangest mysteries, only for the star attraction to refuse to come out. Price later joked that the Irving family had done everything possible to make them comfortable, except produce Gef. It's a wonderfully dry observation, and one that says rather a great deal. Still, Price wasn't ready to dismiss the case. Not yet. Instead, he began studying the house itself. Sometimes the answer isn't in the ghost, it's in the building. Walking from room to room, he noticed something unusual. The farmhouse contained hollow spaces behind the wooden panelling, air cavities, narrow gaps running through the walls. Speaking softly into one opening produced a curious effect. The sound travelled. Not just a little. It echoed, bounced, emerging from entirely different parts of the house. To Price, the implications were obvious. If someone understood the acoustics of the building, they could potentially make a voice appear to come from almost anywhere. The house itself functioned like an enormous speaking tube. Now, that didn't prove anyone had done exactly that, but it did prove something important. The strange voices no longer required a supernatural explanation. There was, at least, a perfectly natural possibility. Even more intriguing was someone else living in the house. Not James, not Margaret, and not Wari. By all accounts, the teenage daughter possessed a genuine talent for ventriloquism. She could throw her voice convincingly enough to amuse friends and family. That detail immediately caught Price's attention. A gifted ventriloquist, living inside a farmhouse with unusually helpful acoustics, where mysterious voices always seemed to vanish whenever outsiders arrived. Individually, none of those facts proved a hoax. Together, they formed a pattern, one that Harry Price couldn't ignore. Yet there was still one problem. Patterns aren't proof. If Price wanted to convince the world, he needed something more substantial, something physical, something measurable. Fortunately, James Irving believed he had exactly that. Hair, paw prints, and even impressions said to have been left by Gef's teeth. Finally, Price had evidence he could actually test. And as we'll discover next, those tiny samples would become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire mystery. James Irving disappeared briefly into another room before returning with a small collection of items. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about them. A few strands of hair, several impressions pressed into plasticine. marks said to have been left by tiny teeth. If the Irvings were telling the truth, Harry Price was now holding the first real evidence that Gef had ever existed. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Stories can be embellished, memories can be mistaken. Even honest witnesses can convince themselves they've experienced something extraordinary. But physical evidence? Physical evidence has a habit of telling its own story. Price carefully collected the samples and arranged for them to be examined by independent experts. If they belonged to a mongoose, it wouldn't prove that the animal could talk, but it would at least establish one crucial fact. There really had been a mongoose at Dawlish Cashen. If they didn't, well, the mystery would become considerably less mysterious. The first samples examined were the hairs. Gef Irving insisted they had come from Gef himself. Price sent them to respected zoologists for analysis, including experts connected with what is now the Natural History Museum. The verdict came back. They weren't from a mongoose. They weren't even particularly unusual. They were identified as dog hair. More specifically, they appeared to match the coat of the Irving's own sheepdog, Mona. Not exactly the breakthrough the family had been hoping for. Next came the footprints. The Irvings had supplied impressions that they believed Gef had left behind in plasticine. Again, the samples were examined by specialists. Again, the results were disappointing. The prints didn't match a mongoose. One expert suggested that one of the impressions could conceivably have been made by a dog. Another appeared unlike any mongoose footprint known to science. But none of them supported the family's extraordinary claims. Then there were the tooth marks. Could they finally provide the proof everyone had been searching for? Unfortunately, no. Once again, nothing about them pointed towards a mongoose. One by one, every piece of physical evidence the Irvings offered seemed to drift steadily back towards the ordinary. Dogs, misidentifications, uncertain impressions, nothing supernatural. For Harry Price, this was significant, very significant. Remember, he hadn't arrived on the Isle of Man determined to debunk the case. If anything, discovering convincing evidence would have been professionally fascinating. The harder he looked, the less convincing the physical evidence became. That doesn't necessarily mean James or Margaret Irving deliberately deceived him. It's entirely possible they genuinely believed the hairs belonged to Gef. If an unseen animal really had been living around the farm, contamination would have been easy. Dogs wandered everywhere. Hair gets caught on fences, it sticks to clothing, it blows across farmyards. But that's precisely why investigators prefer controlled evidence. Good intentions don't make evidence reliable. Meanwhile, something else continued to bother Harry Price. Timing. Or rather, Gef's remarkable sense of timing. Whenever friends visited, Gef chatted away quite happily. Whenever sympathetic guests arrived, he often made his presence known. Whenever journalists wanted a story, there was usually something to report. But whenever experienced investigators appeared with notebooks, cameras, and awkward questions, Gef suddenly became the shyest mongoose in Britain. That coincidence didn't escape Price's attention, nor should it escape ours. After all, if someone truly possessed the ability to silence skeptics forever, why stay hidden? Why refuse the very opportunity that would prove your existence beyond doubt? It's a question believers and skeptics still argue over today. Yet despite his growing doubts, Harry Price was careful, remarkably careful. You might expect Britain's most famous ghost hunter to emerge from Dawlish Cashen declaring the whole affair a fraud. He didn't. Instead, he and Richard Lambert published their findings in a book titled The Haunting of Cashen's Gap, A Modern Miracle Investigated. They stopped short of directly accusing the Irvings of inventing Gef. Some historians believe that caution was partly practical. Calling someone a fraud without absolute proof could easily lead to legal trouble. Others think Price recognised something more subtle, that although the evidence failed to support the existence of a talking mongoose, it also failed to fully explain the family's behaviour. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If worry had simply been throwing her voice, why continue for years? Why endure ridicule? Why lose money when the farm gained a haunted reputation? Why stick to the story decades later, long after any possible fame had faded? People commit hoaxes for all sorts of reasons. Money, attention, revenge, entertainment. The Irving family appeared to gain very little. In fact, they lost quite a lot. The years rolled on, the headlines gradually became less frequent, curiosity seekers found new mysteries to chase. Britain edged ever closer to another world war. But inside that lonely farmhouse, Gef allegedly remained, still talking, still complaining, still demanding food, still insisting that he was exactly who he claimed to be. James Irving himself grew increasingly resigned to the bizarre situation. At one point, when asked about the mysterious creature, he offered perhaps the saddest quote associated with the entire affair. "Gef unfortunately does exist. He is a cross we have to bear." It's such an odd thing to say. Not triumphant, not excited, not proud, just tired. As though living with Britain's most famous talking mongoose had become less an adventure and more an exhausting part of everyday life. Harry Price wasn't the last investigator to visit Dawlish Casham, because another man would arrive with a completely different way of looking at the mystery. He wasn't interested in hairs, or footprints, or hidden voices. He wanted to examine something far more elusive, the human mind, and in doing so, he would propose perhaps the strangest explanation of them all. Not that Gef was real, not that the Irvings were frauds, but that Gef might have been something created, without anyone consciously creating him. By the late 1930s, interest in Gef had begun to fade. The sensational newspaper headlines became less frequent, the steady stream of curious visitors slowed to little more than a trickle. For many people, the mystery had already been solved. There had never been a talking mongoose, just an isolated family, an old farmhouse, and an overactive imagination. But not everyone agreed. One man in particular believed people had been asking entirely the wrong question. His name was Nandor Fodor. Unlike Harry Price, Fodor wasn't primarily interested in exposing fraud, nor was he searching for proof of ghosts. He occupied a fascinating middle ground. A trained journalist, lawyer, and psychical researcher, Fodor had become one of Europe's leading investigators of paranormal claims. Yet over time, his work began to take an unexpected direction. Instead of asking whether hauntings were caused by spirits, he started wondering whether they originated inside the human mind. Today, we'd probably describe him as an early paranormal psychologist. Back then, his ideas were revolutionary. When Fodor examined the Gef case, he didn't dismiss it outright, nor did he embrace it. Instead, he travelled to the Isle of Man, determined to understand the people behind the story. Almost immediately, he noticed something that previous investigators had largely overlooked. The farmhouse itself. Not the walls, not the acoustics, but the atmosphere. Dawlish Casham wasn't simply isolated. It was remote. Even by 1930s standards, the Irvings lived miles from large towns. Visitors were rare. Life followed the same relentless rhythm every single day. Work, meals, animals, sleep. Then the cycle began again. It was a quiet existence, perhaps too quiet. Fodor spent hours speaking with James, Margaret, and Wari. He wasn't trying to catch them in a lie. He wanted to understand their relationships, their personalities, their emotional lives, and one member of the family interested him more than anyone else, Wari. By the time the mysterious voice first appeared, Wari Irving was entering adulthood. Like many young people growing up in isolated communities, she found herself caught between childhood and independence. There were few friends nearby, little entertainment, even fewer opportunities. Fodor wondered whether Gef had become something rather unexpected. Not a ghost, not an animal, but a companion. Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea, Fodor wasn't suggesting Wari had consciously invented Gef. Quite the opposite. He believed something far more complicated might have been happening. He proposed that intense emotional pressures could sometimes manifest in extraordinary ways, not through deliberate deception, but through unconscious behaviour. In modern psychology, we'd perhaps compare it to forms of disassociation or unconscious role-playing. The individual isn't necessarily lying, they genuinely experience something that feels real. Could that explain Gef? Fodor believed it was at least possible. Think about Gef's personality for a moment. He's loud, confident, rude, outspoken. He says whatever he wants. He insults visitors. He mocks authority, boasts constantly. He's everything a quiet farming family wasn't. It's almost as though Gef became the voice that nobody else dared to use. The family remained polite. Gef was outrageous. The family worried about appearances. Gef delighted in causing embarrassment. James was reserved. Gef dominated every conversation, whether consciously or unconsciously. He seemed to express everything the family themselves kept bottled up. That idea fascinated Fodor, because if Gef represented an emotional release, then suddenly many of the case's stranger features made a certain kind of sense. Why did Gef always have an opinion? Because he gave voice to thoughts that might otherwise remain unspoken. Why was he funny one moment and threatening the next? Because human emotions are contradictory. We all experience affection, anger, jealousy, frustration, humour. Gef simply expressed them without restraint. There was one enormous problem with Fodor's theory. Other people claimed to hear Gef too. Not just the Irvings. Neighbours, visitors, journalists. Even investigators reported hearing unexplained sounds, strange whistles, or brief fragments of speech. Did they really? Or had expectation influenced what they thought they'd heard? Psychologists know that suggestion can be astonishingly powerful. Tell someone a house is haunted, and suddenly every creak sounds sinister. Every gust of wind becomes a whisper. Every unexplained noise feels meaningful. That doesn't mean people are dishonest. It means people's perception is remarkably fragile. Could that have happened at Dawlish Cashen? It's certainly possible. But once again, possible isn't the same as proven. Fodor eventually concluded that Gef probably wasn't an animal at all, nor a spirit, nor an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Instead, he believed the talking mongoose was best understood as a psychological phenomenon centered on the Irving family, particularly Voirrey. His conclusions satisfied many skeptics. Others hated it. Believers argued it explained nothing. If Voirrey had somehow unconsciously created Gef, how did visitors hear him? How were warnings supposedly given before strangers arrived? What about the rabbits Gef allegedly caught? What about the sightings outside the farmhouse? The questions kept coming, and once again, the case refused to stay neatly inside anyone's chosen explanation. In many ways, Harry Price and Nandor Fodor represent two completely different approaches to the unknown. Price looked for trickery. Fodor looked for trauma. Price searched for physical evidence. Fodor searched for emotional truth. Neither man proved the existence of Gef, and neither completely explained him either. And perhaps that's why, nearly a century later, we're still talking about a talking mongoose. Eventually, even the strangest stories run out of headlines. The journalists packed away their notebooks. The curiosity seekers stopped knocking on the Irvings' door. Britain's attention drifted elsewhere. Europe edged closer to war. And the remarkable tale of the talking mongoose simply slowly slipped from the front pages. But according to the Irving family, Gef never really left. Although he appeared less frequently than in the early years, they maintained that he still wandered about Dawlish Cashen, occasionally making his presence known with the odd comment, a whistle from another room, or one of his familiar sarcastic remarks. Life, they insisted. It simply carried on. As strange as that sounds, perhaps that's one of the most remarkable aspects of the whole affair. The impossible had become ordinary. Imagine living with something so bizarre for so long that it no longer frightened you. It simply became another part of the daily life, like the old grandfather clock in the hallway or the sheep in the next field. As the years passed, the Irving family faced increasing financial difficulties. Running an isolated farm had never been easy. The publicity surrounding Gef had certainly brought visitors, but visitors don't necessarily pay the bills. Eventually, James and Margaret Irving left Dawlish Cashen. The farmhouse, the place forever linked with Britain's strangest talking animal, was sold. And with that, the stage which Gef had performed for almost a decade finally fell silent. Then came one final twist. Depending on which version of the story you believe, a new owner claimed to have shot an unusual animal on the property. Some described it as resembling a large weasel. Others insisted it looked more like a mongoose. The body, according to these accounts, was displayed locally before eventually disappearing. Was it Gef? Believers certainly thought so. Skeptics, they were unconvinced. After all, no verified photographs survive, no preserved specimen was examined, no scientific records confirm the animal's identity. Like so many aspects of this case, the story exists somewhere between folklore and history. It's impossible to verify, equally impossible to dismiss entirely. James Irving died in 1945. Margaret passed away several years later. Both took whatever they truly believed about Gef with them. But perhaps the most intriguing figure of all was Wari. Remember, she was only a teenager when the mystery began. Many skeptics believed she had been the voice of Gef all along, a talented ventriloquist, bright, creative, capable of sustaining an extraordinary performance. It would have been the perfect opportunity, years later, to admit everything. Wari consistently maintained that Gef had been real. Not necessarily in the way people imagined, but real enough that she never publicly confessed to inventing him. Even when interviewed decades later, she refused to dismiss the experiences her family had reported. Was that loyalty, self-deception, or honesty? Only Wari ever truly knew, and she never gave us the answer. So, what actually happened inside Dawlish Cashen? Let's consider the possibilities. Perhaps Harry Price was right. The farmhouse's unusual acoustics, combined with Wari's reported gift for ventriloquism, created an illusion convincing enough to fool visitors and fuel a legend. It's certainly the explanation that fits the available physical evidence most comfortably. Or perhaps Nandor Fodor was closer to the truth? Maybe Gef wasn't a deliberate deception at all, but an unconscious psychological creation. A vivid expression of loneliness, frustration, imagination and emotional need, given voice with an isolated family living a quiet and repetitive life. That theory doesn't require anyone to be lying, only to be profoundly human. Of course, there are those who reject both explanations entirely. They point to the visitors who claim to hear the voice, the warnings Gef allegedly gave before strangers arrived, the rabbits he supposedly left for the family, the uncanny way he seemed to know things he shouldn't. Could there really have been something sharing that farmhouse? Something we still don't understand? If you're convinced of that, you're certainly not alone. Personally, I think the most fascinating mystery isn't whether Gef existed. It's why this story has survived. Think about it. Thousands of ghost stories have faded into obscurity. Thousands of alleged hauntings have been forgotten. Yet somehow, an argumentative, biscuit-loving, self-proclaimed extra clever mongoose continues to inspire books, documentaries, academic papers, podcasts, and even feature films. Why? Perhaps it's because Gef sits in that rare space where folklore, psychology, and the paranormal all overlap. He's funny enough that we don't dismiss him as frightening. He's unsettling enough that we can't dismiss him as comedy. He's absurd enough that we laugh, yet just plausible enough that we hesitate. And maybe that's exactly where the best mysteries belong. When I first came across this case, I'll admit, I expected a novelty story, a strange little footnote from Britain's paranormal history. Instead, I found something much more interesting. Not because I came away believing in talking mongooses, but because the people involved felt so real. James Irving didn't sound like a man chasing fame. Margaret didn't behave like someone trying to fool the world. And Wari? Whether she was an extraordinary ventriloquist or a young woman caught in an experience she could never fully explain, remained remarkably consistent until the end of her life. That's what keeps me coming back to this story. Not Gef himself, but the people who lived with him. So, what do you think? Was Gef nothing more than a clever performance? A psychological phenomenon decades ahead of its time? A remarkably persistent family legend? Or Was there genuinely something moving through the walls of that lonely farmhouse on the Isle of Man? As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find The Eclectic on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and all the usual podcast platforms. Come and join the discussion because, as you've probably realised by now, this is one mystery that refuses to stay buried. If you've enjoyed today's episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really does help more people discover the show, and it allows me to keep bringing you these strange, fascinating, and often unbelievable stories. Until next time, sleep well. And if you happen to hear scratching in your walls tonight, maybe don't answer back. This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.